right.
There you go.
As you can see, I'm not too familiar with Zoom. Um, April is kind of an interesting time as far as our beekeeping experience has become. Uh, I don't know how many of you are familiar with The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, but in his book, his character Walter Mitty was quoted often as saying full steam or full speed ahead and damn the torpedoes. And that's the way bee season is right now. I was working bees yesterday and 56 hives, and those 56 hives, none of them were really equal. I had very good strong hives. I had weak hives. I had hives in between. I had hives that didn't have any food. I had hives loaded with food. So it required a lot of effort on my part to try to equalize those hives. I had a couple hives that had already swarmed, even though I worked on swarm management. Tom pretty well covered this introduction, but I'm going to talk in two different directions here. One is for new beekeepers who have just started. Their experiences are going to be quite different from those of us who had hives that overwintered. And I do want to point out that it's common for beekeepers to become confused because they get information from people that varies with some issues, such as how do you make splits and maybe whether you should use queen excluders and all those kinds of things. But we all start beekeeping at some point in our lives. And if you've got 2, 3, 4 years experience, you develop kind of a pattern of beekeeping that becomes your system. So beekeeping is a lifelong learning experience. And I think for the most part, once you start beekeeping, you will experience for the most part your first winter, maybe some bee losses. So I'm going to start about beekeeping. Most of you, if you are going to get package bees, may have already received them. Many of you are probably waiting for your packages to arrive because this spring has been rather unusually cold in the South. Here in North Carolina, packages started arriving in March, but in many cases, people had to wait 2 weeks from their scheduled pickup date to get bees. I was told that most of the southern package producers are running as much as 2 weeks to 4 weeks behind in scheduling. I don't know how many of you have ordered packages and were set back, but I'm going to be brief because you have a bee school. I'm assuming you've started, but if you need to start with a package of bees, the picture on the screen shows you a hive and just one method for getting the bees out of your package cage into the hive, and that is you set the package cage down into the hive box itself. You remove some frames to allow that cage to go into the box. You remove the queen from the box along with the can, and the bees will climb out of the box onto frames. And if the queen cage is placed up here between a couple frames, the bees will move into that area very quickly. I've used this method, and I like to go back the day after I put the box into the hive and take it out because the bees will have left the box and joined the queen. Another way to get bees out of a package is just shake them into a hive. This is a fast, easy way, and it saves the trip back to your colony to take the package box out. I'm often asked by new beekeepers, how do I know that I have a queen in my hive? I don't think pulling every frame out to see whether you have a queen or not, trying to find her is the answer. I think is if you have a good eyesight, you can check for eggs. And if you see eggs you can pretty much rest assured that your queen has been accepted by the bees. Boy, once you get your bees in your box and things get started, it's important to check 3 days later or so just to make sure the queen has left her queen cage and that maybe she has started to lay. I don't know, I'm very familiar with Ohio beekeeping and the requirement to register hives. We don't have to do that in North Carolina. In North Carolina, we have a lot of people keeping bees that are not even on the list of beekeepers. And I will talk about this in just a second or two, but it is good to buy bees that have a certificate of inspection. All states that I know of require people who are selling bees to have a certificate of inspection. When you get your package, the person delivering the package to you or you picking it up ought to be able to show you a certificate that the bees that you are buying have been inspected. State bee inspectors also have a very important job educating the beekeeping public because they should be available to answer some questions that new beekeepers might have about things not looking quite right. For example, if your hive more or less has sunken cappings on brood, and you kind of open up a cell and it's kind of little tobacco looking, juicy larva that has melted down into that little gooey stuff, they can tell you that that's American foul brood, and that brings up a good talk by somebody talking about diseases, which I'm not going to do tonight, especially. Common problems can become serious issues if you want your bees to survive. And I'm not calling diseases, I'm talking about pests tonight. Varroa mites, small hive beetles, and wax moth. Those are, in the spring of the year, they are problems to consider. And I like to think of honeybees. I just saw somebody write a blog comment about getting their hive ready as a mother would when her baby's coming home from the hospital. And I also like to think of animals that need food. We spend a lot of money on our dogs or cats or horses, whatever it is, to make sure they got food and they are taken care of. But for beekeepers, we need to be aware of varroa mites. We need to be aware of small hive beetles, and we need to be aware of wax moth. Sometimes if you are starting a package of bees, maybe the first major problem might be that your queen is not accepted by the bees that came in the package. One of the big failures I've seen with new beekeepers is that they watch the population in their hive start to diminish. They can't find brood, and they wonder what the problem is. If they don't solve this problem of not having a queen in the hive is going to fail very quickly. The bees that came in that package will live about 40 days at maximum. So I'm going to address some management issues that we face in the spring: weak hives, swarming, making increases to replace hives that died out over winter, and pest control. I'm not sure what the winter losses have been in Ohio this past year, but I would say down here we're running at about 50% losses. Sometimes a new beekeeper with 2 hives loses all of them. I just talked to one yesterday that lost 3 hives. All of them are dead, and they are starting over with new packages. It's rather discouraging to find people who have these losses that just decide to give up beekeeping. So let's start with this first question. Should I combine a weak hive with a stronger hive. That's one of the ways to maybe take a weak hive and make it stronger. That's one of the reasons why we usually recommend that a beekeeper have 2 hives of bees. So the question is, can I move a frame or 2 of brood over to this hive to help it? I've got a different answer for you. If you have a strong second hive, there are some tricks that you can use to help a weak hive without removing any frames from the weak hive or from a stronger hive to help the weak hive. I like C.C. Miller's 50 Years Among the Bees. I reread it each year. As a matter of fact, I've got a copy real handy right now because I like some of the things that C.C. Miller did. He died in 1920, but his beekeeping practices still fit today very good. He used a beekeeping principle that bees fly from a hive and they return to that hive. If you want to experiment with your bees just a little bit, take a hive and move it, let's say 3 feet. The bees will return to the spot where the hive did set, not make a turn and go into the new hive right away. They will make the adjustment to go into the hive, but they will be quite confused when they return to a spot where the hive is not located. So the answer to strengthening a weak hive is to move the strong hive and then set the weak hive exactly where the strong hive was located. What this does, it means that the flying bees from the strong hive will then occupy the weak hive. And to a certain extent, there is an advantage to this because the larger population returning to the hive will give the queen the ability to enlarge her brood area and keep that brood area warm. Now, I do want to point out that many people worry about, well, boy, they're going to fight. Usually this is not the case. If you move frames from a hive, like a strong hive, to a weak hive, or you take a weak hive and set it onto a strong hive, by manipulating frames, you may be transferring any problem that either the strong hive has or the weak hive has, such as large varroa mite populations or any disease problem. By letting flight bees go into the weak hive, at least the weak hive is not going to transfer any of its problems to the stronger hive, which you don't want to do. If any of you have any questions about this, I'll address those later. We need to check for varroa mite in a hive. This is a thing that you should be doing early in the spring season. I got some packages from Georgia 2 weeks ago, and the first thing I did is I used Formic Pro, and I put boards on the landing board, a white cardboard kind of sheet that's sold by bee suppliers. And if the hive has a mite population and my treatment for the mites is going to work, I will see mites laying on that white board when I pull it out from the bottom board. Anytime I see mites of 2, 3, 4 laying on that white sheet on the bottom board, I know that my mite treatment is working, and I know I do have mites. Some people will talk about varroa mites, don't treat for them. You have a management technique that would determine a point where the mites can be tolerated by the bees. Buying queens, for example, that are mite resistant might be one approach to controlling varroa mite, but I'm going to tell you, mite resistance is not the elimination of total mite control. Mite-resistant queens will tolerate, to a certain extent, a population of varroa mite because the bees are usually very hygienic. Boy, I was looking at beehives like you're looking at here on the screen, just loaded with bees. And I usually call this period of time, here comes the torpedoes, going back to Walter Mitty. It is just heartwarming for me to walk into my bee yard and see hives just flying out of the entrance and bringing back pollen. And when I take the top cover off, you see wall-to-wall bees. If you have a hive like this, you better know what your varroa mite count is. You need to select a treatment plan. You've got to decide if you want to control swarming. And I'll talk a little bit more about swarm management. And then you could take a strong hive like this and make increases. If you find a hive like this that has swarm cells in it, it's very easy to make splits because you can use those queen cells that the bees have built before they swarm to make splits. So I really ask this question. Do you want to prevent swarming? Do you want to find a swarm? This is the season where we're going to have these decisions to make. I would assume that Sandusky County Club has a swarm list. If you're new to beekeeping, it has to be put on it. If you're a member of the club, I'd ask to be put on it anyway. Do you want to put up swarm traps? Do you want to stop at the local fire department and let them know you'll pick up swarms? If you have a neighborhood that has a local news media of some kind, usually a web page or something, post a notice that you would be delighted to pick up swarms. If you have a friend that has some property, especially if they have a beekeeper that's a neighbor that has beehives, you might ask them if you can put a swarm trap on their property. The neighboring beekeeper might do a better job of controlling the swarms if that were sitting there. And swarm traps should be placed at least 8 feet above the ground. Any experienced beekeeper who has kept bees knows that it's extremely hard to stop a hive from swarming. If you read a book and it says cut queen cells to stop it, it's not probably going to work too well, because if you miss one queen cell, the hives are still going to swarm. But if you cut down all the queen cells and they're in the mood to swarm, they'll still build new ones to replace the ones you cut down, and they'll swarm anyway. The major reason bees swarm is because by nature, that's the way they propagate themselves. And if the brood nest gets crowded or congested is what we call it, it reduces the number of cells that are open for a queen to lay eggs in. I've also made a note here that a queen excluder is called a honey excluder. If somebody asks you about queen excluders, do you use them or not? As far as I'm concerned, if they're not used correctly, they're just going to create a swarm real quick. How do you prevent a swarm? You can split strong hives to make increases. In the South, if you're in business selling bees, you can easily sell the swarms that would come out of your hives in packages to new beekeepers or people who need to replace, a dead out hive. You can use a management system to replace some brood frames that are clogged up with honey and pollen with drawn comb or new foundation. This is called checkerboarding. You place a new frame of foundation, for example, between two frames that have already drawn comb. And it's not a problem if you are using deeps and you're doing this with a deep hive, but if you have a deep hive body and a medium hive body on your hive, it's pretty hard to move deep frames out of the bottom box because you're going to need to add a deep super on top of the hive, the medium super, to accept the bottom frame. Also, I don't know how many of you are familiar with slatted racks, but a slatted rack was developed by Miller, and it allows the bees to cluster below the brood chamber when they get crowded. I'm going back to swarm traps here. It's easy to make swarm traps. The internet is loaded with plans on how you can build them. But a colony of honeybees can be found in a house where you would recover the colony. This is something that requires a lot of experience. First of all, I'm going to say, if you get into somebody's basement, you tear out the ceiling where the swarm has settled between the joist, how are you going to easily remove these sheets of comb without them dropping on you? It's not easy to do, and it's a very messy operation, and usually most homeowners don't particularly appreciate bees flying around in their basement. You can buy swarm traps, something like a pot that trees are put into. It's pretty much like a basket, and you can place it in a tree or up in a tree, 8 to 10 feet above the ground, put a swarm lure in that trap, and the likelihood of getting a swarm is pretty good if there are other bees in the neighborhood. And by the way, if you want to find out whether there are other bees in your neighborhood, I suggest you take a small saucer, put some honey in the saucer, and just see how much bee population shows up at your saucer. And if you get bees coming to that saucer, there are bees within 2 miles of your location, and they'll find a bee trap if they're looking for one. These are some pictures just showing how you would handle removal of bees from a house and how you would take comb out of a bee trap if you used one of these pot type shape. If you use a nuke box with frames already in it, the job is much easier. But you can take old comb, if you were taking it from a building like this is behind the siding, you have to cut a hole in it and take the comb inside the wall out and put it into a frame. You tie it in or use rubber bands to hold the comb and brood. And that's another way to start a hive. I would not tackle this unless you have some carpentry skills and you've talked with the homeowner about some of the problems of bees. This happens to show a window ledge and the inside of a house that had the bees located in the wall. They were going in, by the way, in this little hole that carried electricity into the wall. Something I always like to do when I work with beekeepers in a bee yard and we have a field day, one of the real fun things is to see how people react to hiving a package of bees, or I mean a swarm of bees. Collecting a swarm is fun and it's educational. Swarm bees, generally speaking, are gentle. You as a hobby beekeeper can often do it without a bee veil or bee gloves. But if you're a new beekeeper, I'm going to tell you, you should wear bee equipment until you feel comfortable. I was talking to a beekeeper in Georgia 2 weeks ago. I went down there to pick up my packages, and he was sharing a story as a brand new beekeeper, catching a swarm of bees at a um, location where a semi truck had parked. They were hauling bees, and it had parked for a little while, and then it moved on. All the bees off the truck had gathered on a billboard. And he thought, okay, I can go over there and get those bees and put them into a box. Unfortunately, those bees were not as gentle as a swarm normally is, because bees that are going to swarm usually engorge themselves with honey. And because they can't really bend their abdomen down to sting, you can work safely with them without worrying too much about it. But this guy walked up to this swarm hanging on the billboard, no bee veil, no gloves, and started to take a bee brush and brush them down into his hive body, and they just attacked him. And he got over 50 stings out of that experience. To do this, all you need to do is take a package of bees, make sure you spray the sides of the screen with a little bit of sugar water, attach a queen to a limb, or in this particular case, a cross, and you can take the cage itself and kind of fasten it to the tree limb close to where the queen is, and the bees will move over to the queen, and it will look pretty much like a natural swarm. Or you can just dump the bees like on this cross onto the ground, and the bees will crawl up and form on this cross, and you can then demonstrate how to put the bees into a hive. You need to have all your equipment ready to hive a swarm, by the way. I have captured swarms when I didn't have any equipment, just put them into a cardboard box, about the size of a bushel basket. If you're wanting to capture a swarm, if you locate it on a branch like this, if it's close to the ground, it's pretty easy to put your box under the swarm. Just give the branch a little shake, and the bees drop down into the hive. And this picture shows you the results of shaking the bees. Some people will take a sheet, lay it on the ground, and shake the bees in front of the hive, and then watch the bees parade into the hive. But I've seen a person in Sunbury, Ohio, who had to catch the same swarm 5 times. And the problem was he didn't get the queen. The queen was still hanging on the limb up in the tree, and he would shake the bees down into kind of a 5-gallon bucket, and then go down and dump the bees into the hive. Next thing he knew, they were right back up there in the tree with the queen. You do need to get the queen. We're going to move on to mites and pests of the beehive. Up in this corner, we see mites on larvae, and it's very easy to see mites on drone brood. You can use a capping scratcher to kind of lift the cappings on drone brood and pull out the pupa. And since the pupa is white, the mites really are easy to see. If a beekeeper has just begun or had a hive survive the winter, now's the time to get some idea how many mites you have in your hive. I did a mite check the other day and found very few mites, but I am going out to the bee yard probably on Wednesday and put my strips into the hive anyway, even though it's a small number of mites that I saw. If you want your hive to have a chance to survive this coming winter, you should be checking for mites on a regular schedule. I say at least once a month. There's another easy test to take a sample of about 300 worker bees in a little pint jar. All you need to do is just move this jar up to these bees and scoop them into your jar, put a lid on it. Many lids have a screen that is inside the jar lid that allows you to shake the sugar out of the jar and then examine that sugar for mites that drop off of the bees. One nice thing about using sugar is if you get the queen, and I think she's right there, you've got to be careful, because if you take a sample and you use powdered sugar, you don't kill the bees. You could also use the same jar technique and use alcohol in the jar. Alcohol will kill the bees. It does give a more accurate result. And if you dump powdered sugar onto a sheet like is shown down here with the bees will take off from that sheet and fly around like a little ghost. And then all you need to do is count the mites that are down here on this piece of paper. This is the alcohol wash test. What you can do is take your jar. This is alcohol. The bees are trapped in this jar with the alcohol. They're dead. Then you just filter or screen the dead bees so that they are collected and you can dispose of them. And what remains under the screen will be the mites that were on those bees. This gives you a pretty good count of the mite count that you have. Most people recommend you have 300 bees in a sample to get some idea of what your heavy light mite load might be. If you only collect 25 bees, you won't have anything like this to see what really is going on inside of your hive. I have been always a person who does not like to treat bees for mites. I don't like putting chemicals in my hives, but I found in order to survive and not buy packages every year, the cost of strips or whatever you use is cheap compared to buying packages. I have used oxalic acid, and I have used mite away strips, and I've used products that have fluvalvinate in them, Apistan strips. And quite frankly, I don't know which is best because people who use strips in hives still end up losing bees when winter approaches. Another pest that I find people who don't look at their bees very often, and if there is a problem with the bees, wax moth will take over a hive, and you get something like this. They're wax moth worms. Wax moth are a little white moth, very easy to see. They leave a little egg. It's mostly like a little white grain, not white, black grain of sugar. The egg hatches and a larva is formed, and quite frankly, they can do a lot of damage within a hive of bees in a very short period of time. Another problem that a lot of new beekeepers have is with ants. Ants can be found usually visiting beehives, but I haven't found ants to be a real problem, but they seem to be a problem for people who really do a lot of crazy things, like try to build moats around their beehive so the ants can't swim across to the hive, or using cans on legs that they fill with oil. I don't find ants that troublesome. I'll show you an example where I do see them troublesome, but yellow jackets, hornets, ants, they will take advantage of a very weak hive. You don't usually see problems if your hive is very strong. You don't see problems with wax moth if your hive is really strong. Ohio does have small hive beetle, but we have a real problem down here in the summertime with small hive beetles. And we generally use beetle traps. You can buy them on the internet, but we do have fire ants. I don't know whether you can see this picture or not, but fire ants will build a sand hill right around your beehive. And down here, I've learned that if you've got wax moth problems, and the wax moth that pretty well messed up the inside of your hive, all you got to do is find one of these fire ant hills and just set your beehive right down on top of it. And those ants will go up and really clean out the wax moth larvae and do a pretty good job so that you don't have to recycle everything. I use a solar wax melter. And by the way, my solar wax melter was working really good today. To use frames, put them into a solar wax melter and melt all the junk wax that's in that frame so you can recover it. There are some other pests, skunk, raccoon, mice, bears. We have bears in North Carolina. Ohio has bears in the eastern part of the state, and they can do some really terrible things to a hive of bees. And then I lived in London, Ohio, and this is a picture I took of a soybean field next to the property that I owned. And this is an airplane that would fly down over that field, killing the insects that were feeding on the soybeans. And of course, there's wind drift. And beekeepers in Ohio back 10 years ago had real problems with drift from farmers who were applying neonicotinoid kind of dust for corn and things of that sort, and reported a lot of dead bees. The best thing to do is, if you have your bees someplace where they are spraying, mosquito spray, whatever it is, get notified so you can cover up your bees when something like this is going on. So coming soon, you've got some questions to deal with. When do you add honey supers? When can you make increases? How many of you, and this can be a discussion we can have a little later on, is how many of you are going to add to your beehive collection this year? I can tell you that I had 4 hives of bees last year. I've got 26 right now, and I'm planning to add 24 queen nukes to what I already have. So I have a reason to make increases. I want to make a little bit of money, and I can sell this. Maybe if I can get some nukes to survive the winter this year, I could get maybe $180 to $200 per nuke. I don't know what they're selling for in Ohio, but that's a nice sideline income to have. So with your questions, I'm going to let you ask me when you add honey supers in Ohio, and when you can make some increases and how you would make those increases, because those are topics that could be an entire meeting all of their own. So if I can turn this back to you, by the way, I do write a weekly newsletter. And if you want to contact me about getting on my mailing list, you can contact me at stallmanapries@aol.com and just say, Dana, add me to your list. I would appreciate knowing that you're from Ohio, because I can include information in my list, which would be meaningful to you as well. So I'm going to stop my share at this particular time. And if we can go to questions or anything of that nature, I'll be glad to, get back into the swing with you guys. It's very difficult for me to talk to a computer, look into the computer screen. I do like in-person meetings, and it's not so flat and boring, I think, to sit and listen to what you might interact with me on. So let's get to questions.
Dana, there's one question on here with the wax moth. Are the frames reusable when you scrape the wax moth off of them, or should they rewash them, or how do you get them ready to put back in the hive?
That's a real good question. I use black plastic foundation in my frames, and you can recover and restore those frames very easily if wax moth have done a lot of damage. What I do is take the plastic out of the frame. It just snaps into a frame. You don't have any wires or anything like that running through your comb. And you can power wash it off very easily. So I have seen frames that when you've used natural wax foundation, that's unrecoverable, other than sticking them in your solar wax melter and melting. I've got a message coming in and I'm going to try to delete it here. Okay. I had a chance. I was the president of Central Ohio Beekeepers at one time, and we had a bee yard on the Ohio State campus. And Sue Colby had a semi-trailer to store bee equipment in. And we found some hives that were in pretty bad shape with some wax moth on them. And just for an experiment, we took the entire hive body with the wax moth and set it on top of a very strong hive of bees. Believe me, the bees cleaned that wax moth mess up and rebuilt comb back on those old frames. But you got to use a very strong hive of bees. You can't put it on the weak hive and expect them to do something like that. Are there any other questions? And interact with me, because I want to, answer and talk. If you don't get the answer you're looking for, let's see why.
Dana?
Yes.
I had a problem with hornets last year. The little ones like that come around at festival time.
Mm-hmm.
And they were infested and getting in my hive. And I took a vac and tried to kill as many of them as I could. But then I took a bottle and added some meat to it, and set it in front of the hive so they would crawl. They cut the top off and inverted it in the bottle. But they destroyed my hive. I mean, they actually killed it, and the hive was full of honey. So
Mm-hmm.
what could you do in that case?
Well, let me ask you a question. What was the hive population, bee population, when you noticed this problem?
Well,
Was it a weak hive?
no, it was a pretty strong hive. I mean, I don't want to tell you it was excessively strong, but it wasn't that weak because there was bees, flying in and out. But it slowly, over maybe a week period of time, it slowly destroyed the hive.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't steal the honey; they just killed the bees.
Right. Generally speaking, hornets can do that, but it's because there's another issue maybe with the bees, the population of bees. Maybe they're stressed from some other problem that allowed hornets are like wax moth and small hive beetles. They're opportunity kind of oriented insects. And so they pick on the weak hives and leave the strong hives alone. But to answer, how do you prevent that? I've never heard anybody tell me before about putting some meat in front of the hive to distract the hornets, but I think that's a neat idea.
Well, they'll eat the meat and stuff. If you've ever taken, I've tried it already. Just taken a small piece of like hamburger and set it in front of a bunch of hornets like that, and they'll devour that in no time at all. They'll just eat it up, and you'll get hundreds of them. That'll take that hamburger away. And that's what I tried. I tried to get some kind of a meat in there where I knew they would crawl down. When I got done, that bottle was a small Coke bottle, a small Pepsi bottle, and that was probably a third full of hornets after it got done. They got in there and died.
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, you had a lot of hornet population picking on a hive of bees. If you had that many hornets in your pop can, the only other suggestion I could make would be to reduce the entrance.
They already did. I had it reduced down to where it was like a fourth of the entrance width, like a couple inches wide. It was reduced. That's why I couldn't figure out why they were getting in.
Right. And one other suggestion I would have is to take a double screen, put your weak hive on top of a stronger hive. There's a Snellgrave board that's commonly used when you make splits that takes advantage of the heat of a stronger hive and then lets you make a split by taking frames out of a hive and putting it above a strong hive. And then you can introduce a queen into that weaker hive, and they really, the heat from the hive below assists that small colony to have a larger brood nest. And a larger brood nest can be converted into bees, which in turn also allow the expansion of the brood nest. And if you're looking for a honey crop, for example, it's important to have a lot of bees. And if you
Well, you know, the thing is, you know, I ended up with about 3 or 4 gallon off that hive, and like I say, the frames down below had plenty. I bet there's a gallon in the frames yet that are in the hive that the hornets didn't take. That's why I think the hive was a strong hive, but they just annihilated it by getting in. The hornets did.
Right, I've seen hornets destroy a hive. I've always thought to myself, though, that there's something, the hive didn't have the bee population to defend itself. And you know, hornets can communicate just like honeybees. The honeybees go out and they find a good location. Let's say they find a hive that's weak, and they have this ability to communicate with each other and tell the others, hey, you know, there's honey in that hive. And of course, the difference between wasp and honeybees thrive on somebody else's honey, and the wasp thrive on meat by eating the bees. Does that make sense?
Yep. I thought about trying to move it too. That might have been a possibility, just to like it covered up at night, you know, and move it over during night. So, you know, another spot.
I have found that might work for a day if you throw a sheet over it or something like that.
Yeah.
And move it. But honeybees, if there is no flow coming in, and that's when we have robbing issues, if there's no swarm coming in, there are bees out there, scout bees, or wandering around looking for, let's say, the opportunity to take over another hive. And raising queens, for example, one of the big problems with raising queens is you use smaller nukes, 5-frame nukes, or even smaller than that. And if the honeybees around this queen yard discover that there's a hive that's got some food in it, feeding them, spilling syrup, or any place on the ground, those honeybees go to that spot, and they just can make life miserable for a beekeeper who's trying to keep small hives alive. We use robbing screens, things of that sort, to prevent that. But wasps are the same kind of thing. They are opportunistic. Small hive beetles are opportunistic. Wax moth are opportunistic. And so the stronger your hive, the better the hive has to resist those things.
Well, thanks, Dana.
Well, I appreciate your question and your comments.
There's a question here, Dana. Somebody treated a hive with oxalic acid, but forgot to remove the super. What can he do with the honey frames from that super?
Oxalic acid, I'm aware of a study that Tom did with the effect that oxalic acid had on queens in a hive. You can have Tom explain that study that he did. But I have questions of whether it's honey that a study, any kind of test that they could do on it to determine what the parts are per million, what effect that would have on human consumption. I don't know of any study that I'm aware of. There might be some out there, but it would be good feed without any doubt for starting package bees or helping feed a hive that needs food. I would be somewhat hesitant to use it, or more likely to sell it to customers. I've used oxalic acid, and by the way, that stuff will burn if you get it on your skin, that stuff is bad for your lungs. If you read the instructions on how to use it, you know, you need a respirator and gloves. I don't think that's a good idea if you have any oxalic acid. And it's a vapor for the most part. Or you could use a drip method, mixing it with sugar water and stuff. But maybe somebody has some experience with how it affects honey. I don't. Formic acid pro, by the way, is listed on a label that you can use it during the honey season.
One other question. What are suggested means of defending against coons and skunks?
I can start with skunks, okay? If you have a problem with a patch of ground in front of your beehive that's bare, where, you know, during the day you go out and there's something that's trampled down, if you got grass or weeds, all that's trampled down. Skunks will eat bees. They've killed skunks with bees in their stomach. And they will take a sizable portion of the bees that they eat. They'll scratch the entrance. The bees will come to investigate what's disturbing them, and the skunk will eat. The problem, once it starts, the skunk will return each night. And generally speaking, the bees will become very aggressive when you try to work with a hive. The answer is to put the bees on a hive stand that's 16 or more inches above the ground. Could use cement blocks, or you could build a regular hive stand with 4x4 posts with 2x6s or 2x8s to hold the beehive above the ground. And that would pretty well take care of the skunks. Or there's another issue. You could take a trap, an animal trap. You need more than just one of the little miniature jobbies. And just hope that the skunk wanders in. A good bait for the skunk, by the way, is a little bit of sardines or something like that. And they'll go into the trap and set it off, and then you've got a disposal problem.
Cover it with vinyl. You can haul them away that way.
I'm sorry, what?
Cover them with a tarp.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You can carry them away. You don't scare them. Try to keep from scaring them, but you can.
Yeah.
It works. I mean, I've done it already, but you just got to be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. The scent that they deliver to keep people away is rather strong and uncomfortable to walk into a house with somebody who's with you, you know. Opossums are problems too. Possums will bother beehives. So let's talk about raccoon just for a minute. Raccoons are clever. They can actually take a lid off a beehive. They are somewhat like bears. Raccoons, I had a problem with the Ohio Queen Project in 2011. We raised queens to help Jim Two's Bee Lab out, and we were using mini nukes. And I don't know how many of you have seen bear problems where you find frames scattered all around, but what the bears do is they attack a hive, tear it apart, and they'll grab the frames and haul it some distance away. And I think they've learned that many bees on a frame will fly back to the old hive position, and they can then eat the brood, which they prefer. Skunks don't do that, but raccoons will. If they can attack a hive and get a hold of a frame and pull it out of a hive, they'll eat the brood in the frame. One thing you could do is use a ratchet strap to hold the hive cover on your hive. If you have a small nuke, 5-frame nuke, for example, they can handle a 5-frame nuke just like a bear handles a regular size hive. And they'll pull frames out and pull them away from the hive and eat the brood. So again, you can trap them. Um, I have a friend that had a very bad situation with a raccoon. They can bite and inflict a terrible wound on you. My friend had a coon bite him in the ankle, serious to his Achilles tendon, and it hobbled him up for quite a long time. And then you've got the problem of rabies. So they're nothing to fool around with. I have caught raccoon in traps, and they don't swim too well.
They commit suicide.
Yes.
That's what mine always I have a problem with. They seem to commit suicide for some reason.
Question here was a question related to the best practice around making splits. It's a pretty
Dane, I can elaborate a little more on that. Good evening.
Oh, okay.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
So my objective, I'm getting queens in, and let's say I've got some real strong hives. I'm trying to understand if there's like a limit to how many splits out of a hive. My objective is not to make a ridiculous amount of nukes and sell them. My objective is honey, but I would like to prevent swarming as best I can.
Okay.
And so if that's my objective, what have you done for number of splits? And do you recommend replacing the frames you take out with foundation or drawn comb, and in what pattern would you replace the comb back in, that type of thing? Just
Well, I'm delighted with that particular question because I was dealing with that yesterday. And there's, how many splits do you want? How many hives of bees do you want?
20.
20?
Yep.
I'm going to really share with you some things from 50 Years Among the Bees with C.C. Miller. If you don't have that book, it's available as a reprint online. You can buy it through Amazon. I've got a copy, which is an original first edition, which I would not give up. I mean, this book is, Dinah Samatero also has a book, which I think is really good. It's now in the 5th edition, but it's a handbook. Covers just about everything you would want to know about beekeeping. But when it comes to splitting hives, there are people with one hive that want to make 9 hives out of one. Take every frame they've got in their beehive, put it in a nuke, and let the bees build queen cells if there's brood on those frames. And eventually, by the time you get to winter, you might have a fair amount of bees within a nuke that has a chance of surviving the winter, but you get no honey crop or anything else. I think in the 1890s, there was a fellow who claimed to have made 36 beehives out of one hive. And you can have 36 beehives, but as far as I'm concerned, they're all welfare hives. You might be able to say, oh, I've got 36 hives of bees, but they're pretty much worthless. You got to feed them, take care of them, take more time with them. So you need to be a little bit more reasonable. How many hives do you have right now?
40.
How many?
40.
40 hives. Oh, you're in good shape. Out of those 40 hives, you probably have got 9 that are really strong.
Yeah.
Would you say that's fair?
Yeah. So should I?
I'm going to give you.
Go ahead. Focus on the really strong. The weak ones, I'm not sure what to do with them. The medium ones, probably leave them alone. The strong ones, I can make splits, is kind of my rationale.
Okay. Well, some people would probably take some frames of brood and so forth and put into your split or your weaker hives. Build them up. C.C. Miller is kind of like my Bible when it comes to making splits, but he was able to make splits. And let me tell you this, not all at one time, but C.C. Miller took 9 hives of bees, took 1 frame out of each of those 9 hives of bees. And then this went into a deep hive with bottom board and top cover. And then he would move his strongest hive and set that hive in that place. So you got 9 frames of bees with brood, no queen. You've got a hive setting in the location where the strongest hive was. And that strong hive, by the way, when it's moved, only takes 2 weeks to really recover all that bee population that it loses. And you've got one egg-kicking new hive that is going to raise a queen, has a lot of bees in it. You put a queen excluder on top of that hive and start adding honey supers. And you're going to get a honey crop yet this year. And if you did, you could do that by making up one new hive every week. Each hive loses 1 frame. Sooner or later, you're going to get to the point where you can take a frame out of a number of hives. And instead of making 1 new hive every week, you could make 2 hives every week. And or maybe you get to the point where you can make 3 hives every week. When you got 40 hives of bees, you can make a lot of increases each week. If you want to speed the process up, you could go buy queens and add a new laying queen. And boy, you've got a hive that very quickly is going to produce honey. By the way, brood bees don't usually produce honey. It's the foraging bees that produce honey. And so if you take time with the brood bees and they raise their own queen, that's only a period of 12 days before they have a virgin queen, because they start with a larva before they, they don't start with eggs. And in that 12-day period, they'll be laying within another week after they've emerged from their cell. And so you could then keep moving beehives, look for your strongest hive and move it and put your new hive right there. 1 frame from 9 hives, 1 frame of honey. You want to make sure they've got food. And what's the limit? Starting in July of prior to 1920, Miller writes of making 56 hives starting in July from 9 hives. He went from 9 at the end of July to 56 hives. It's in his book, tells you how to do it. So does that answer your question?
You said sooner or later you have a lot of bees. I think sooner or later you run out of time real quick.
Well, it costs you every time you add a hive of bees, it's going to cost you a lot of money. One of the biggest sticker shocks I have is what it cost you, even if you were to build your own hive of bees. If you were to buy a board 8 feet long, 12 inches wide, put that board on a saw and start cutting out the pieces, you're going to have $20 in that board that's 12 inches wide by 8 foot long. I can't believe the price they're getting for lumber today. I went to buy a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, $42. 1 sheet, 4 by 8.
Thank you. Just real quick, do you have an opinion either way on when you take that frame of bees out, whether you put foundation or drawn comb in? Or
okay, I'd put foundation in.
Okay.
Right now in the spring, you put in foundation. Later on, you use drawn comb. Because if you've got a honey flow going on, it doesn't take, I've seen a medium super filled in a week from foundation. I mean, the bees drew out the comb, filled the comb, and but you need, let me just touch on another problem people have is there's a lot of difference between bee yard locations. If you have your bees in a location where there are a lot of other beekeepers keeping bees, that area 2 miles around your hive, for example, you've got your bees have a lot of competition for the resources that are out there. But if you can go and find a farm that's growing buckwheat, you could put your bees out there on 40 acres of buckwheat and have no problem whatsoever. You need to talk to your ag extension agent and just ask him who's growing what crops. Wheat, corn, soybeans don't cut it anymore. getting GMO. I noticed in Ohio, my honey production from the late 1980s up through 2000 really dropped off, started going downhill. In other words, the amount of honey I could produce was just going down year after year. I had 36 bee yards in the Columbus, Ohio area, in the county surrounding Franklin County. And today, I couldn't find one of those bee yards. They're all housing developments and everything like that. There's even the farms are gone, and the new roads going up Sawmill Road. If you're familiar with Columbus, I don't even recognize the place.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that question. If you are a small beekeeper and you only have 1 or 2 hives, let me try to address them as well. Does David have a question?
I don't believe.
Okay. Well, if you're a person who's not into bee fever and you're not on steroids, if you have a hive that's really strong, one good swarm control is to make a split. And you can do something such as planning to keep one hive of the 2 hives you're going to have, keep one very strong so it collects some honey for you. So let's say you've got 8 frames of brood. I'd make a new hive up that would take 2 frames of those 8 frames, buy a queen, because a hive with a queen saves about a month, let's say 25 days in that neighborhood of brood that will build up into a bigger colony and pay for itself. When you stop and think about the price of honey, if you paid $35 for a queen and people are getting, let's say $9 for 16 ounces of honey, it doesn't take very much honey to pay for that queen. But I would say take 2 frames with bees and brood, move the strong hive to a new location, take the old hive and move it to a new location, then set your new hive in the same place where your old hive with a strong population was located. All of the flying bees, foraging bees will come into your new hive with 2 frames of brood and a brand new queen. It does not take that hive very long to get a lot of strength. Nothing like a package of bees and nothing like even a 5-frame nuke. It will just explode. And so you would end up with 2 strong hives. If you try to make up a new hive and it's like equal, maybe of those 8 frames, you got 4 frames in one hive and 4 frames in another. Wherever you move one of those hives, whether it's got the queen in it or whether it's the new hive, the hive setting on the old hive population site is always going to be stronger than the new hive that you make up. In other words, 4 frames of brood and 4 frames of brood will not end up with everybody being equal after 2 weeks. Because the hive that sets on the old location is going to be stronger. Okay.
Good deal. There was one question here about colors of hives. We see so many different colors. Is there a suggested color for a hive?
Don't think it bothers the bees at all. Even if you don't paint them, bees do quite fine. A lot of people will paint their hives white. In fact, I've painted all of my hives white, but not because it helps the bees at all. I've got a farm I take bees to for pollination. Farmers who are paying you for hives like to see nice hives. They don't want a bunch of cruddy junk brought in and set down and pay you for, pollination fees. If you've got nice looking hives, they look upon those beehives much better. If you lived in a neighborhood, if you have a hive painted white, everybody knows you're the bee guy in the neighborhood. But if you want to reduce being the bee guy in the neighborhood because generally speaking, if you're the big guy in the neighborhood, everybody that's got a bee problem comes and blames you for it. So I'd paint probably an olive green, put it in my backyard. I wouldn't put it in my front yard and announce to everybody in the neighborhood you got bees. Gray seems to be a popular color. If you happen to go into a store that's got used paint, they're selling it for $1 a gallon or something like that. Just mix it up. You'll get a cruddy looking gray. Still provide protection to your hive equipment, but be harder to see. Out of sight, out of mind.
One other question. Oh, what was the name of the board or the screen partition for stacking a weak hive on a strong hive? What was that called?
That's Snellgrave. Snelvegrave. It's an English design board. If you go on the internet, you can find it. It is basically two screens with separating the bees. That's the purpose behind the screen. And it's got slots on 4 sides of the board that can be closed or open to allow the bees to fly from that particular box. Usually you turn it around and have the new hive that you're trying to get going flying out the back side rather than the front side, so there's not much drifting.
Good deal. I think there was one more here. I lost 2 hives over the winter. How do I protect those hives until I can get my new bees?
Do not put them in a dark place. For example, I've seen people wrap hives in black bags, and they think that's going to keep the moss out of them if they put them downstairs in the basement or some dark place. The best thing to do is put them into some area where they're not going to get rain damage, but set them so that light can enter the hives. You can set them up on edge. You've got to worry about mice getting into them. That's another problem. But essentially, the wax moth won't bother them if there's light and air ventilation passing through the hive.
Good deal.
The worst thing you can do with wax moth is think you can put a bag around them and keep the moth out. Probably the eggs are already there. And by the way, another thing, keep them cool. Hot conditions promote the wax moth development.
Any other questions? Did I miss anybody questions here, or anybody else have any questions?
One question, Dana, when you were talking about pressure washing the frames, take them out of take the plastic out of the frames and pressure wash them, should you re-wax them?
The answer is yes, but you better, if you're going to take the sheets that have been damaged and try to pressure wash them, you might blow them halfway across the county. What I have set up here is basically some angle iron and then a clamp that holds the plastic in the angle iron. And then when you spray wash it, you get a good job. You can take a hive tool and clean it off as well. But I highly recommend going to the dollar store. Go to the area where they sell tools and things and grab some of those brushes that are made out of I don't know what it is. It's kind of like a sponge type material. And they're disposable. And you just dip that down into some melted wax and then just lightly go over your frames. The object is you don't want to put too much wax onto the frame, which hides the cell foundation because the bees build the foundation out from those ridges. But to leave a little wax coating on all those ridges, some people use a roller. They take a roller and just dip the roller into wax, and they will then just roll the wax onto the foundation. It uses up quite a bit of wax if you really do it right, but it's good. Bees will work it. And if you don't do that, they'll probably build wax down from the top edge of the frame and not even on the foundation you want to put the wax on, or the comb. I've got some wonderful pictures showing mistakes. The bees do their thing. If there's too much space between plastic foundation, in other words, you've got a 10 frame box and you only put 9 frames in it, you leave too much space between frames, you'll have a very difficult time getting your wax drawn out. So the closer, just, I like to get foundation drawn out in a checkerboard fashion. A frame of drawn comb, a space, a frame of drawn comb, and then put the brand new foundation between the two. And they usually do a pretty good job with plastic foundation if you do that. It's a good question.
Any
other questions? Yeah. Go ahead, Doc.
No, you go right ahead. We're all squared. I think we got all the questions in the chat area, I believe, covered.
Well, I'd like to share with all of you that I really appreciate being able to share these thoughts with you. I was sad to see the Buckeyes lose in the tournament. I am surrounded by North Carolina, which kind of blew it this year as far as tournament teams. NC State was out the first game they played. Duke didn't get even a chance to go. Well, excuse me, NC State went to NIT and they got out early, and NC was out their first game. So
The Zags had a lucky shot.
how's that? Oh, I'm going to tell you that
was a lucky shot.
that is
It went in though.
That's the thing about basketball. I was a coach at one time in New London, Ohio, junior high school basketball coach. And there's a lot of exciting things that can happen. I've seen a team lose that was 4 points ahead, 10 seconds to go in a ball game. They couldn't make their foul shots.
Tough loss.
And that was in the time before we had the 3-point shot. And they still won. It's just amazing. 10 seconds is a long time.
Yeah.
Well, Dana, thank you very much for the presentation tonight. It's very informative and interesting.
Well, as I said, I like to be in a group where I can kind of look around and see how what reactions I'm getting to what I say. And when I look at my TV screen, I get no reaction at all. It is my pleasure. Tom, you and I have got a past, and I love to see what you're doing with Ohio State beekeepers. I will always have a soft spot in my heart for Sandusky, or Sandusky Beekeepers Association.
Thanks,
Thank
Dana.
you.
I appreciate it.
We've had Dana up at our bee club a couple different times over the years, teaching queen rearing classes. I think one time at Steve Geiger's and once or twice here at my place alone. And I spent about a week and a half down at Dana's house, and he taught me queen rearing down there when he lived down in New London. So he's a very informative individual. I appreciate everything he's taught me. And I continue trying to, I've taught, I don't know, maybe half a dozen of the beekeepers in the club here now with queen rearing, and trying to just pay it forward, Dana. So,
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm
Thank you.
82 years old and I'm still on beekeeping steroids. And it seems like you just can't get it out of your blood. And I'm fortunate to be involved here in North Carolina. I've got 5 students to mentor this year in Wake County. I've got another Zoom meeting coming up Thursday, and then I've got one coming up next week on the subject of making splits. And so I try to stay involved, and I learn a lot from my students. When you talk about new beekeepers just starting out and what they have to learn, if you've got any new beekeepers listening, my God, spend the money necessary to protect yourself against bee stings. I see a number of people who just quit. They really are enthusiastic about beekeeping, and then they go out to the bee yard and their bees attack them. They're scared of the bees from that day on.
Yep.
Yep. That's
So
I see we got 5 more chats. Okay. I'm just reading the chats here quick. Everybody's just saying thank you, Dana. Everybody
Yep.
appreciated it.
I'll
So,
pass on the word. I appreciate them as well.
all right. Well, that's pretty much our April meeting, guys. And we'll, hopefully I think, well, Dana, we're going to maybe have Barb Bloucher next month. She's going to talk on mites and on hive inspections and things like that, stuff that OD&A they have to do. And then in June, I think we got Nina Bagley set up to come up to the club, and she's just going to kind of do a little different type of queen rearing, on the spot queen rearing that Mel teaches. And this is something different than grafting and doing that type of queen rearing. So other than that, if anybody's got any other questions for tonight, if not, we'll just call it an evening. So
Basketball games coming up.
yeah. All right, guys. I think that's
Alrighty.
it. All right. Well, good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Doc and Tom, for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Glad it works out.
Okay, I'm going to be signing off.
All right, Danny. You take care and tell Judith I said hello.
Well,